What if I told you that the practicalities of tipping on app delivery services such as Uber Eats and Doordash operates completely different from what it does in the traditional sense and in the so-called real world? This is What If I Told You Thursday edition of something a little bit different than normal. This is not a historical event or an individual in history. That is not. But it is a bit of a surprise to a lot of people out there, so I thought I would feature it. And as a part-time driver for the app services, I feel like I'm very qualified to speak on this one because I know exactly how it works. Tipping in the delivery apps for your dinner is a very different concept than it is when you sit down at a dining restaurant, or even order pizza delivery from a pizza delivery restaurant. And this is kind of the downside of these apps, at least from the deliverer's perspective. It can still be a decent income thing, which I'm doing until any of my social media or book things take off. But tipping absolutely is vital to how fast you get your food delivered. And you're thinking, well, shouldn't a tip be for good service? In these apps, that is not the case. Tipping is entirely for the purpose of enticing a driver to deliver you your dinner or lunch or whatever meal it is. Now, how much should I tip? Well, that kind of depends on your locale. If you're in an urban center and you're only asking somebody to deliver a mile or two, I happen to believe that $5 is a decent amount. Now, in case you're wondering, whoa, what about all these extra fees that I'm paying to have my food delivered? Very little of that goes to the driver. I'll just decide that right off the bat. A typical delivery on either DoorDash or Uber Eats pays the driver $2 in base pay. And that's regardless of distance. So, I live and operate out of the northern Twin Cities exurbs, which means a lot of my trips are of a substantial distance into country settings. Now that's a reward in and of itself, being able to drive, make quiet drives, and I don't have to deal with urban traffic when I do a lot of this for the most part. Traffic is almost a non-existent function here in the northern Twin Cities exurbs. But an order comes up to go 18 miles out of town, and it's only for the $2 minimum. You know what's going to happen to that person's order? It's going to sit at the restaurant all night because no driver in their right mind is going to take that. Somebody in that particular situation, if they're 18 miles outside of town, a $20 tip would be highly recommended. And for an even bigger order, I would say even more so. It probably makes a little bit more sense to tip based on percentage if you're talking about a larger order, because that will result in a tip that will entice a driver to accept your request. Now, you must be wondering what the difference is between Uber and DoorDash. Well, that is involved in a practice that is called tip baiting. Uber allows it and DoorDash does not. And I think tip baiting, what that is where a customer puts in a larger tip than they typically would and then removes it after the trip is done, leaving the driver high and dry. Well, this is a highly discouraged practice to me for obvious reasons. Number one, that driver's never delivering to you ever again. And I'm in a small town of 20,000. And this particular area does, if you get one or two drivers on your bad side, you're never going to be able to place an order. You're going to have to crawl your ass into town to pick up your food. or come to the grocery store and put everything you need together to make it yourself, which is going to be healthier for you anyway, but I digress. DoorDash does not allow this. Once you put in the tip and pre-tip the order and the order is accepted by the driver, that is it. You know, that's going to be what he's going to get, or she. That's going to be what the driver's going to get. $2 plus whatever your tip is. Now, outside of the exceptions I mentioned there about, large extreme orders or certain special trips, I would suggest that you take a look at the map and figure out how far your driver is coming from the pickup point to deliver to you. So let's say you're coming from a restaurant from here and they're going 15 miles out of town. That is going to actually be my suggested tip. And probably even more so if you're feeling rather generous, because a driver in a market like mine has to account for my empty mileage coming back. And where I live in is the largest restaurant hub for roughly a 300 square mile area. A driver in an ex-urban or a deep suburban area is not going to get any deliveries heading back to where they came from, because most of these areas are in rather remote or ex-urban areas that don't have restaurants or don't have places to pick up from. Now, in a major urban center, and I said I live in the Twin Cities exurbs, so let's say you're talking about in the middle of a city like Minneapolis or St. Paul. Most of those trips are only going to be 2 or 3 miles tops. So in that particular case, a $5 tip is more than sufficient, because you're also paying that driver for the time that they're going to spend waiting at the restaurant for their food, which in a lot of places, certain restaurants are much worse than others. So you're going to want to compensate for the time that they spend waiting for your dinner to come out of the kitchen. And so that would be my suggestion in that particular regard. If you're in the middle of an urban area, like I said, a $5 tip is more than sufficient. You only kind of come in and got a couple miles. Exception, of course, being that if you're making somebody come all the way across town. So say you've got, like a prime restaurant in downtown Minneapolis. You live in the western suburbs and they're coming about 5 to 10 miles out. Then that $ per mile model that I presented earlier would be my suggestion in that particular instance. Now, if you live in an area that is suburban and they have an opportunity to get other orders, that's going to be more than enough. They're not going to really sweat the return mileage to where they're coming from. But that said, if you are in a rural or ex-urban area, you really need to consider how much time that your driver is waiting to pick up your food, and also how much miles that they're putting on their vehicle. Because what most drivers do not understand, to the level that I do, is that vehicle expenses are a very big part of the gig economy driving equation. Most drivers believe that gas is their only expense, but I'm going to tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. There are 4 portions of the equation for vehicle expenses on a vehicle and operating it. Those 4 are, number 1, gasoline, of course. 2 is called deferred maintenance. That's things like tires, replacing wiper blades, replacing light bulbs, and things like that. Those are called deferred maintenance because those are almost never, the impact of those is almost never felt when you're making the deliveries, but they are felt out after you make a long series of them. Tires need to be replaced, windshield wipers need to be changed, light bulbs need to be replaced, headlights will burn out. I don't know what that warning is that just came up on my camera, but anyway, those are the types of things that will happen to a vehicle over time. So that's deferred maintenance. Number 3 is the car payment if they have one. Now, if your driver's driving a junk beater that they paid straight cash homie for, and if they bought it Randy Moss style, number 3 not going to apply. They're not going to be in hock for anything. And most delivery vehicles are in this category. Now, where you're going to run into vehicles where they are making stiff payments are for your Uber and Lyft drivers. So in the food equation, equating that into your tip situation, that's generally not going to be applicable because most people do not drive, extravagant vehicles for these purposes. I, for example, drive a 2018 Kia Sorento, which is a larger vehicle, doesn't get great mileage, but at the same time, my payments are not very steep. The 4th equation is insurance. And if you're like me, the car payments and the insurance kind of gets split up a little bit because I drive half the time to a full-time job, half the time I work remote, so the miles that go towards my driving towards to and from my physical office, which is about 20 miles from here, 40 miles daily on the weeks that I go in, those miles don't count towards the rideshare equation because they're not driven for food delivery purposes. So that equation for somebody like myself who doesn't do this full time is a little bit different from somebody who does. Now, I will also add that most these days there are very few people who do this full time, and for good reason. The pay has absolutely exponentially crashed since the pandemic, when this was a big booming business, and it no longer is. And so the gig companies have cut pay accordingly. So in order to entice drivers to make their deliveries and to actually make their business even operate to begin with, these companies put the advanced tips into the displayed offer on a trip. So let's say that driver from customer who's 18 miles out of town, who doesn't tip, and it shows up as $2 to go 18 miles. Their food is going to be cold. It's going to be in the restaurant all night. And DoorDash in particular has made this very well known. They're not really hiding this from their customers anymore. They're trying to entice their passengers to this part of the delivery economy equation, and they like, hey, you sure you don't want to tip, because if you do, you're more likely to get your order delivered on time. I've not seen any of this type of effort from Uber, but it's still part of the equation. The exception on Uber in particular are for deliveries like Walmart deliveries, grocery deliveries, where they're part of like the Walmart app, for example. And Walmart, of course, has like a Walmart Plus option where deliveries are free. And so the offers that they and Walmart corporate designs those formulas, Uber doesn't. But those base pay equations on those types of deliveries, so let's say you're ordering your groceries through Walmart or Target, tips are not going to be part of the equation because the big box stores in particular factor this into their equation, and then they make the offer to the drivers accordingly. So you generally not going to have to worry about your orders being marooned at a store for lack of a tip. We also have a dog food store called Chuck and Don's. Same situation. Those big box types of chains will factor this into the equation. They will make a rather more enticing offer, shall we say, to make sure that their packages and food get delivered. So those are the exceptions. Most of those are on the Uber platform. And that's also true of like Walgreens, for example. Occasionally you'll see on those platforms a prescription delivery. You don't really need to tip for those either, because that is factored into the equation. Those are the big companies that pay, on long-term contracts with Uber or Doordash, and they will factor those necessary offers into their equation on how much they pay the delivery companies to have their drivers deliver their goods. Restaurants, on the other hand, different ballgame entirely. The restaurants are already paying a pretty substantial amount of their menu prices towards these delivery apps, and the delivery apps are only giving the drivers $2, maybe $3 base out of all this. So tipping at a restaurant through the delivery apps is absolutely essential if you want to make sure that you get your food on time or get your food at all. So that is my Thursday night edition. What if I told you that tips on delivery apps function very differently than they do in brick and mortar restaurants? So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you learned something too. My little area of expertise, and I hope it doesn't remain that way forever, but nonetheless it is. So we'll see you on Friday night for another edition of What If I Told You. And I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I always pull up something decent. So hit that like and subscribe button if you are learning and just enjoying the content here. I'm thinking about upping the game here, and I'm ordering a PC for book publishing purposes, but I want to also use that for video editing purposes. Might want to put a little bit more pictures and graphics into these things. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be a real improvement here. So I've already invested in the PC, and hopefully if you have any suggestions on what software I can use to achieve that, I'd appreciate that too. So thank you very much, guys. Now I'll just say it again. Peace out, homies.